doesn't corrupt everyone. Sometimes it simply exposes the kind of person they already were. The executive couple had spent years climbing the corporate ladder by humiliating anyone they considered beneath them. Waiters, receptionists, junior employees. Nobody ever challenged them because everyone feared their influence with the board. During the company's biggest gala of the year, they spotted one quiet man standing alone in an old Navy suit and decided he would become their next joke. In front of shareholders, directors, and hundreds of guests, they laughed as red wine streamed down his face, calling him an embarrassment who didn't belong among successful people. They thought they had impressed the board. Instead, they had publicly humiliated the man who had quietly built the company they worked so desperately to control. And what happened next would create a nightmare they would live regretting. Before we continue, can you tell us where you're watching from? It always amazes us to see these stories bringing people together from every corner of the world. If you enjoy stories where integrity is rewarded, arrogance has consequences, and ordinary moments lead to extraordinary justice, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Earlier that afternoon, the loudest sound inside the factory wasn't the machines. It was laughter. Workers joked with one another as another shift slowly came to an end. Sparks flew from welding stations. Conveyor belts carried freshly assembled equipment toward loading docks. Forklifts weaved carefully between towering stacks of finished products. For thousands of families, this factory wasn't just a workplace. It was food on the table, school fees, mortgage payments, a future. Few people understood that better than Keanu Reeves. Instead of watching from an executive office, Keanu walked the production floor in a simple navy suit. The jacket carried faint grease stains. Dust covered the sleeves. His polished shoes had long since lost their shine beneath a thin layer of factory dirt. He didn't mind. His father used to say, "If your shoes stay clean while your workers are getting dirty, you're leading from the wrong place." Keanu had never forgotten those words. He stopped beside assembly line 7. An elderly machinist carefully tightened the final bolts on an industrial gearbox before wiping his hands on an old blue rag. "Afternoon, Frank." The old man looked up. A wide smile crossed his weathered face. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu chuckled. "I've told you for 20 years. It's Keanu." Frank laughed. "And I've ignored you for 20 years. I noticed." Nearby, a young apprentice watched the exchange with surprise. He quietly asked another employee, "The chairman knows him." The older worker smiled. "No, he knows all of us." Keanu picked up one of the finished gearboxes. It felt heavier than it looked. He inspected the welds, ran a finger along the edges, then smiled. "Beautiful work." Frank shrugged modestly, still got a steady hand. "You've got more than that." Keanu gently set the gearbox down. "You've got pride, and that's harder to teach." As he continued walking, workers greeted him from every corner of the factory. "Afternoon, Mr. Reeves." "Good to see you, sir." "How's Emma?" He answered every greeting, asked about spouses, remembered birthdays, congratulated one employee whose daughter had just graduated from college. None of it felt rehearsed. He simply remembered. packaging department. He noticed a maintenance technician standing beside a silent air conditioning unit. The young man looked frustrated. "Problem?" The technician sighed. "The compressor failed." "How long?" "Almost 3 weeks." Keanu frowned. "And nobody fixed it." "I submitted the paperwork." He hesitated. "It keeps getting pushed back." Keanu looked around. The room felt uncomfortably warm. Workers wiped sweat from their foreheads while packing heavy equipment into wooden crates. "What temperature does it reach in here?" 95 degrees. Keanu slowly nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a phone, for a worn leather notebook. Its corners had softened with age. He wrote one sentence: "Replace building 4 compressor today." The technician looked surprised. "You're writing it yourself." Keanu smiled. "If I leave it to memory, someone else waits another 3 weeks. A familiar voice called from behind. "Mr. Reeves." Maria, the 70-year-old janitor. She pushed her cleaning cart across the polished concrete floor. Keanu immediately walked over. "How's your grandson?" Her face lit up. "He passed every exam. He starts engineering school next month." Keanu smiled broadly. "I knew he would." Maria laughed. "You believed before he did." She became quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." She glanced around to make sure nobody else was listening. "The new vice president. He walks past us every morning. So, he never says hello anymore." Keanu looked toward the far end of the factory, then back at Maria. "My father taught me something." She waited. "If you ever become too important to greet the people cleaning your building, you've become too important to lead it." Maria smiled. "I wish everyone believed that." "So do I." Just before leaving, Keanu noticed a young cleaner struggling to push an overloaded waste container. Without saying a word, he grabbed one side. Together, they rolled it across the floor. The young man looked horrified. "Sir, you don't have to do that." Keanu smiled. "My father made me clean this factory every summer." The young man laughed nervously. "The chairman." Keanu nodded. "He used to tell me." He looked around the enormous factory. "If a floor is beneath you, you've forgotten who built the ceiling." The entire aisle fell silent. Several workers exchanged smiles. Some quietly repeated the sentence to themselves. They knew they'd remember it for a long time. Outside, a sleek black company sedan waited near the front entrance. The driver opened the rear door. "Ready for the gala, Mr. Reeves." Keanu looked down at his dusty suit. The grease stains, the wrinkled sleeves, then back toward the factory, where thousands of workers were beginning their journey home. He smiled. "Yes." The driver hesitated. "Would you like to stop home and change first?" Keanu gently brushed a little dust from one sleeve. "No, but the entire board will be there." "I know. They'll all be wearing designer suits." Keanu quietly climbed into the car. "My father used to say." The driver leaned closer. "Never arrive at a board meeting looking richer than the people whose hard work paid for it." The driver smiled. "I've never heard that before." Keanu looked out the window as the factory disappeared behind them. "I just hope the people at tonight's gala still remember it." What he didn't know was that before the evening was over, the same dusty suit that reminded him of his father's greatest lesson would become the reason two powerful executives made the biggest mistake of their lives. The company sedan rolled quietly through the city. The factory slowly disappeared behind them. Its smokestacks faded into the evening skyline. Keanu never looked at his phone. Instead, he looked out the window, watching hundreds of employees driving home after another long shift. Some headed toward small apartments, others toward family dinners, some toward second jobs. He smiled quietly. Every one of them mattered. The driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Mr. Reeves." "Yes. Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you still visit the factories yourself?" Keanu smiled. "Because balance sheets don't tell you if someone's exhausted." The driver nodded. "I suppose they don't. They also don't tell you whose child just got accepted into college, whose wife is recovering from surgery, or who's quietly thinking about quitting." The driver thought about that for a moment. "So that's why everyone knows your name." Keanu shook his head. "No, I know theirs." The black sedan turned beneath the illuminated entrance of the Grand Meridian Hotel, tonight's venue for the company's annual board gala. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Valets hurried from vehicle to vehicle. Camera flashes lit up the entrance as local business reporters photographed arriving executives. The driver stepped out first and opened Keanu's door. "You still have time to change." Keanu looked down at his dusty sleeves, then smiled. "I already dressed for the most important meeting today." He buttoned his jacket, and it wasn't this one. Inside, the ballroom glittered beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. A live orchestra played softly. Waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne. Round tables stretched across the hall, each decorated with white roses and crystal centerpieces. Nearly 300 guests filled the room. Board members, major shareholders, senior executives, their spouses. Every conversation revolved around profits, expansion, acquisitions, success. Near the entrance, a young waiter accidentally bumped into an executive while carrying drinks. A few drops of sparkling water landed on the man's polished shoe. "I'm so sorry, sir." The waiter immediately reached for a napkin. The executive jerked his foot away. "Watch where you're going." The young waiter lowered his head. "It was an accident. It was incompetence." Several nearby guests awkwardly looked away. Before the waiter could apologize again, a calm voice interrupted. "Are you all right?" The waiter turned. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu smiled warmly. "I'm asking about you." The waiter looked surprised. "I'm fine." Keanu handed him his own handkerchief. "For your hands." The young man accepted it. "Thank you." Keanu quietly looked toward the executive. "We've all dropped something before." The executive forced an uncomfortable smile. "I suppose." Keanu nodded politely. "Enjoy your evening." Then he continued walking. The waiter watched him disappear into the crowd. A smile slowly replaced his embarrassment. Across the ballroom, Vice President Richard Langford adjusted his tuxedo. Expensive watch, perfectly styled hair, confident smile. Beside him stood his wife, Vanessa, elegant, beautiful, and convinced she belonged above almost everyone else. She slowly scanned the room, judging dresses, jewelry, watches, people. There, she quietly nodded toward the entrance. Richard followed her gaze. What? The man in the blue suit. Richard frowned. What about him? He looks like someone's maintenance supervisor. Richard laughed softly. Probably got invited by mistake. Vanessa watched Keanu shake hands with a few junior employees. He doesn't even belong near the board. Richard smirked. Someone should tell security. Neither of them noticed. Several longtime employees smiling warmly as Keanu walked past. A maintenance supervisor stopped him. Mr. Reeves. Keanu immediately shook his hand. Good evening, David. David laughed. I wasn't expecting you to remember me. You fixed the boiler during the winter blackout. You saved the entire conference center. David smiled proudly. I was just doing my job, and you did it well. Vanessa watched the conversation from across the room. She frowned. Why is maintenance talking to board guests? Richard shrugged. People forget their place. At another table, an elderly board member quietly smiled as he watched Keanu moving through the ballroom. Director Samuel Brooks, 80 years old, one of the company's original investors. He whispered to the woman beside him. He still does it. What? He speaks to the employees before he speaks to us. She smiled. Just like his father. Samuel nodded. Exactly like his father. Meanwhile, Richard accepted a glass of red wine from a passing waiter. He took a sip, then looked back toward Keanu, still standing alone, still wearing the dusty navy suit, still carrying himself with complete calm. Richard smirked. You know, Vanessa smiled. I was thinking the same thing. He'd make tonight a lot more entertaining. She glanced around. Several executives were already watching, some whispering, some quietly laughing at the sight of the dusty suit among designer tuxedos. Vanessa picked up a crystal decanter filled with deep red wine from the nearby table. Richard chuckled. You wouldn't. She smiled confidently. Oh, I absolutely would. Across the ballroom, Keanu quietly stood beside one of the large windows overlooking the city skyline. He wasn't looking at the guests. He was looking down toward the factory lights still glowing in the distance, thinking about his father's words, thinking about the workers finishing the night shift, completely unaware that behind him, two people were about to turn a quiet evening into the biggest mistake of their entire careers. The orchestra continued playing. Soft violins drifted through the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors. Laughter echoed from every corner of the room. No one noticed that the evening was about to change forever. Keanu stood quietly beside the tall windows. The city stretched endlessly beneath him. Lights from the distant factory still shimmered against the night sky. He smiled faintly. Somewhere out there, the night shift had already begun. A young waitress approached carefully. Excuse me, sir. Keanu turned with a warm smile. Good evening. She held a silver tray. I noticed you haven't had anything to eat. He smiled. I've been distracted. She laughed softly. My grandmother always says important conversations should never happen on an empty stomach. Keanu chuckled. Your grandmother sounds wise. She thinks so too. Both of them laughed. She handed him a small appetizer. I made these this afternoon. Keanu accepted it. Thank you. She hesitated. Mr. Reeves. Yes, my first day here. You carried a tray for me after I twisted my ankle. He smiled. I remember. You remembered my name. You looked terrified. I was. You aren't anymore. She smiled proudly. No, I'm not. Across the ballroom, Vanessa watched the exchange. She rolled her eyes. Look at him. Richard laughed, trying to fit in. Vanessa lifted her glass of red wine. I've met people like him. Richard looked amused. Oh, they wander into events they don't belong at, hoping nobody notices. Richard smirked. And if somebody does? Vanessa smiled coldly. They usually leave. Nearby, director Samuel Brooks overheard part of the conversation. He slowly looked toward Richard. His expression tightened. He'd watched Richard change over the years, promotion after promotion. His humility had disappeared. Another board member leaned closer to Samuel. Should we say something? Samuel quietly shook his head. Not yet. Why? Sometimes people reveal exactly who they are when nobody stops them. Across the ballroom, Keanu noticed a busboy struggling to collect several heavy serving trays. Without saying a word, he walked over. Need a hand? The young man looked embarrassed. Oh, no, sir. Keanu smiled. They look heavier than they are. The busboy laughed nervously. They're actually heavier. Keanu picked up 2 of them. Together, they carried the trays toward the kitchen entrance. Several guests watched, confused. One whispered, "Who's that?" Another shrugged. No idea. Richard couldn't believe what he was seeing. He actually works here. Vanessa laughed. I told you. She picked up a crystal decanter filled with deep red wine. Its ruby color shimmered beneath the ballroom lights. Richard grinned. This should be entertaining. Inside the kitchen, the head chef looked up. His eyes widened immediately. Mr. Reeves. Keanu gently placed the trays onto the counter. Evening, chef. The older man smiled. You shouldn't be carrying dishes. Keanu looked around. Everyone else is. The chef laughed. Your father used to do exactly the same thing. I learned from the best. The young busboy quietly whispered. You know Mr. Reeves. The chef looked genuinely confused. Know him? He smiled proudly. This company wouldn't exist without him. The young man froze. What? Before the chef could explain, Keanu gently interrupted. Let's not make a fuss. The chef nodded respectfully. As you wish. Back inside the ballroom, Vanessa adjusted her evening gown. She looked toward Richard. Watch this. She walked confidently across the room. Richard followed a few steps behind. Several executives noticed. Conversations began slowing. Something about her expression suggested trouble. Keanu had just returned from the kitchen. He thanked another waiter for refilling a guest's water glass, then quietly stepped aside near one of the centerpieces. He never noticed Vanessa approaching from behind. She stopped only a few feet away, looked him up and down, then laughed loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Unbelievable. The conversations around them immediately began fading. Keanu turned politely. "I'm sorry." Vanessa smiled with open contempt. "I was just wondering how someone dressed like you managed to get past security." A few uncomfortable laughs echoed through the room. Keanu remained calm. "I was invited." She laughed even louder. "I'm sure you were." Richard stepped beside her. "Maybe the catering entrance." More laughter. Keanu simply smiled. "I hope you're both enjoying your evening." Vanessa looked almost disappointed by how calm he remained. "Oh, I haven't started enjoying it yet." She slowly lifted the crystal decanter. Rich red wine swirled inside. Director Samuel Brooks quietly stood from his chair. Something felt terribly wrong. "Vanessa," his warning came too late. She smiled, raised the decanter high above Keanu's head, and emptied the entire bottle. Red wine cascaded over his hair, down his face, across his navy suit. The ballroom fell completely silent. The only sound was the wine dripping onto the polished marble floor. Vanessa looked around proudly, then laughed. "There. Now you actually look like the embarrassment you came here dressed as." No one moved. No one spoke. Keanu slowly wiped the wine from his eyes. His expression never changed. He calmly looked at the ruined suit, then quietly said, "My father isn't going to like what you just did." The room froze. Nobody understood what he meant. But somewhere across the ballroom, William Harrington, the chairman of the board, had just walked through the doors. He looked at Keanu, then at the wine-soaked suit, then at the crystal decanter lying on the floor. The color drained from his face because he recognized that suit immediately. It wasn't just any suit. It was the last birthday gift Keanu's late father had ever given him. And William knew the nightmare had just begun. Not a single person moved. The orchestra stopped playing. A violinist slowly lowered his bow. Somewhere in the ballroom, a wine glass slipped from someone's hand. It shattered against the marble floor. Nobody even looked. Every eye remained fixed on Keanu. Red wine dripped steadily from his hair, down his face, across the navy suit his father had once proudly handed him. Years earlier, his father had smiled and said, "Wear this until it falls apart." A good suit isn't measured by how expensive it is. It's measured by the life you live while wearing it. Keanu had never forgotten. He quietly removed a folded handkerchief from his pocket, calmly wiped the wine from his face, then looked down at the crimson stains spreading across the jacket. For a brief moment, he simply stared, not because of the embarrassment, because that suit carried memories no amount of money could ever replace. Vanessa mistook his silence for weakness. She laughed. "I suppose now everyone can see why people should dress appropriately." A few executives forced awkward smiles. Most remained completely silent. Something about Keanu's composure made them uncomfortable. Richard folded his arms proudly. "Perhaps next time, you'll think twice before walking into a room reserved for successful people." Keanu slowly looked at him. His voice remained calm. What makes someone successful? Richard smirked. I shouldn't have to explain that. No, Keanu nodded. You probably shouldn't. William Harrington began walking across the ballroom. Not quickly, purposefully. Every step echoed against the marble floor. Several directors immediately noticed him, then stood, one after another. Every original board member rose from their seats. The newer executives looked around in confusion. Why was the board standing? Vanessa frowned. What are they doing? Richard looked toward William. I'm not sure. William stopped beside Keanu. He looked at the wine-soaked suit, then quietly asked, Are you all right? Keanu smiled faintly. I've had worse days. William's eyes drifted toward the ruined jacket. I'm sorry about your father's suit. Keanu gently brushed another drop of wine from the sleeve. So am I. For the first time, Vanessa felt a knot form in her stomach. She looked at Richard. Why does the chairman know him? Richard forced a laugh. He probably donated to one of the company charities. William slowly turned toward them. His face carried none of its usual warmth. Mrs. Langford. Vanessa smiled nervously. Good evening, Mr. Harrington. William ignored the greeting. Did you do this? She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. Yes, I was protecting the reputation of the company. Several people quietly looked down. William asked another question. From whom? She blinked. I'm sorry. You said you were protecting the company's reputation. He looked toward Keanu. From whom? Vanessa glanced at the wine-soaked suit. From people who clearly don't belong here. The ballroom became even quieter. William slowly closed his eyes, almost as if those words physically hurt him. When he opened them again, his disappointment was unmistakable. Richard stepped forward. Mr. Harrington, my wife was only trying to maintain standards. William looked directly at him. What standards? Richard frowned. The image of the company. William nodded slowly. I see. He glanced toward Keanu, then back at Richard. So, you judged a man without asking his name. Richard confidently answered. His appearance told us everything. Keanu quietly spoke for the first time in nearly a minute. No, he looked at Richard. It told you everything. You wanted to believe. Those words landed harder than anyone expected. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. One director quietly whispered, My God. William looked around the ballroom, then addressed the entire room. I'd like everyone's attention, please. 300 conversations died instantly. Every employee, every shareholder, every guest turned toward the chairman. William took a slow breath. I've served this company for 31 years. He looked toward Keanu, and during that time, I've had the privilege of working beside the finest leader I've ever known. Richard smiled faintly, believing William was talking about himself. The smile disappeared when William extended his hand toward Keanu. The man standing beside me is not an employee. Silence. He isn't a guest. Another pause. He isn't a consultant. Richard's face slowly lost all color. Vanessa's breathing became uneven. William looked directly at every person in the ballroom, then calmly finished. He is the founder of this company. A wave of shocked whispers swept through the room. William wasn't finished. He is the majority shareholder. Another pause. And he owns this company. The ballroom exploded into stunned silence. Not a single person laughed anymore. Vanessa looked at Keanu, then at the wine dripping from his suit, then back at William. Her hands began trembling. Richard whispered only one word. No, but deep inside, both of them already knew. The nightmare had only just begun. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The orchestra remained silent. The waiters stood frozen in place, trays still balanced in their hands. 300 people stared at Keanu Reeves. Only moments earlier, most of them had seen a man in a dusty navy suit. Now, they were looking at the founder of the company. Vanessa's fingers slowly released the crystal decanter. It slipped from her hand. Crash! The glass shattered across the marble floor. She barely noticed. Her eyes never left Keanu. You, her voice trembled, own the company. Keanu calmly answered. Yes, nothing more. No arrogance, no satisfaction, just the truth. Richard's legs suddenly felt weak. His mouth had gone dry. This has to be some kind of misunderstanding. William Harrington slowly looked at him. There is no misunderstanding. He turned toward the board members. Would every director who was present at the company's founding please stand? One by one, 8 elderly directors rose from their chairs. Each looked toward Keanu with quiet respect. None hesitated. William continued. How many of you watched Mr. Reeves build this company from a rented warehouse? Every hand remained raised. Richard stared at them. His heart sank. Samuel Brooks slowly spoke. I invested before the company had its first customer. He smiled at Keanu. I've never regretted it. Another director nodded. I watched him mortgage everything he owned because he refused to lay off a single employee during the recession. A third director quietly added, he skipped paying himself for almost a year, so every worker could take home a paycheck. The room fell silent again. Many of the younger executives had never heard these stories. Vanessa looked around desperately. She was hoping someone would laugh. Someone would tell her it was all a joke. Nobody did. Richard cleared his throat. Mr. Reeves, I'd like to apologize. Vanessa immediately nodded. So would I. Keanu looked at both of them. His expression remained calm. I believe you. Relief flashed across their faces. Then, Keanu quietly continued, but I don't think you're apologizing. Because of what you did. Silence. I think you're apologizing. Because of who I turned out to be. Those words struck the room like thunder. Richard lowered his eyes. He couldn't deny it. Keanu slowly walked toward the center of the ballroom. Wine still stained his suit. Not once had he asked for another jacket. Not once had he complained. He looked around at the executives, then quietly asked, if I had been. He paused. The maintenance supervisor you thought I was. Would either of you be apologizing? Neither Richard nor Vanessa could answer because everyone in the ballroom already knew the truth. They wouldn't have. Keanu looked toward the waiters serving drinks, then toward the housekeeping staff, standing quietly near the entrance. Finally, he looked at the security guards. My father built this company with one belief. He smiled faintly. Every person wearing our badge deserves the same respect. He paused. Whether they clean the floors or sit in the boardroom. Several employees quietly wiped away tears. The young waiter Keanu had helped earlier lowered his head. He'd never felt prouder to work there. Keanu turned toward William. Can you do something for me? Anything. I'd like every employee working tonight to join us. William smiled. I was hoping you'd ask. Within minutes, the ballroom doors opened. Housekeepers, kitchen staff, dishwashers, maintenance crews, valets, receptionists, nearly 100 employees entered the ballroom. Many looked nervous. Some thought they were in trouble. Keanu waited until everyone had gathered. Then he stepped onto the small stage. No spotlight, no prepared speech, just a man in a wine-stained suit, looking at the people who had built his company. I have a question. He looked across the room. How many of you have ever felt invisible at work? Slowly, hands began rising. 1, 10, 30. Eventually, more than half the employees had their hands in the air. Keanu nodded quietly, then looked toward the executives. Look carefully. His voice remained gentle. These are the people who make sure our customers leave smiling. He paused, and somehow they've been made to feel unseen. The room became painfully quiet. Keanu slowly stepped down from the stage. He walked toward Maria, the elderly cleaner from the factory. She'd been invited to the gala for 30 years, but she'd always stayed near the back. Tonight, Keanu walked straight to her. He smiled. Maria. She looked embarrassed. Sir. He gently shook his head. No. He took the microphone, then said something no one expected. I'd like everyone here to meet the woman who has kept our oldest factory spotless for 32 years. Every head turned toward Maria. She covered her mouth in shock. Keanu continued. She has never once asked for recognition, but tonight, I think she's earned it. The ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause, a standing ovation. Maria began crying. She'd spent 3 decades making sure others were noticed. For the first time, she was the one being seen. Richard watched the applause, then looked at the wine stains, still covering Keanu's father's suit. Only now did he finally understand. He hadn't humiliated the owner of the company. He had humiliated everything the company stood for, and that realization was far more terrifying than losing his job. The applause slowly faded. Maria wiped tears from her eyes. She had spent 32 years making sure everyone else's workplace stayed clean. Tonight, for the first time, 300 people knew her name. Keanu gently handed her the microphone. She immediately shook her head. Oh no, I can't. He smiled. Just tell them one thing. She looked around the ballroom, nervous, embarrassed, then quietly said, I've never been ashamed to clean this company's floors, because the people who built this company, she looked at Keanu, always made me feel like I belonged. The room erupted into applause once again. Keanu smiled. Thank you, Maria. She hugged him tightly. I watched you grow up. I know. You haven't changed. Keanu chuckled. I've got more gray hair. Maria laughed through her tears. So do I. William stepped beside Keanu. May I? Keanu nodded and handed him the microphone. William slowly faced the ballroom. I've served on this board for 31 years. He looked around. And tonight, I owe every employee an apology. The room became silent. I spent too much time protecting quarterly profits and not enough time protecting our culture. He lowered his head. That's my failure. Several executives looked at one another. None expected the chairman to admit fault publicly. William continued. Culture doesn't disappear overnight. He looked toward Richard. It disappears. One ignored greeting. One act of arrogance. One humiliation. At a time, Keanu quietly nodded. His father used to say almost the same thing. Richard finally stepped forward. His confidence was gone. He looked nothing like the polished executive who had entered the ballroom earlier. He faced the employees, then slowly bowed his head. I've spent years believing leadership meant being admired. He swallowed. I was wrong. He looked toward the young waiter from earlier. I'm sorry. The waiter nodded politely. Richard turned toward the housekeeping staff. I'm sorry. Then toward security. I'm sorry. Finally, he looked at Maria. I'm especially sorry to you. The ballroom remained quiet. Keanu studied Richard carefully, not judging him, trying to understand him. He finally asked one question. Richard, yes, when was the last time you ate lunch in the employee cafeteria? Richard frowned. I don't remember. When was the last time you visited one of our factories? Silence. When was the last time you learned the name of someone cleaning your office? Richard slowly looked down. I can't answer. Keanu nodded. I know. He turned toward every executive in the room. Neither can most of you. Several board members lowered their eyes. They knew he was right. Keanu slowly walked across the stage. My father believed something. He smiled faintly. He said, if your employees only know you from company emails, you're already too far away to lead them. He looked around the ballroom. Tomorrow morning, every executive, including myself, will report to one of our facilities. Confused expressions spread across the room. No offices, no assistants, no reserved parking. He smiled. You'll work beside our people. Housekeeping, security, maintenance, factories, warehouses, customer service, reception. 1 full week. A vice president frowned. Mr. Reeves, you want us to observe? Keanu quietly shook his head. No, I want you to work. Another executive looked shocked. But we've never. Keanu smiled gently. I know. That's the problem. Even William laughed quietly. I suppose I'm cleaning something. Keanu smiled. I've already assigned you. Oh, the night maintenance crew. William chuckled. They're going to enjoy this. The ballroom relaxed. For the first time all evening, people smiled again, not because the tension had disappeared, because hope had returned. Then, Keanu Keanu looked toward Vanessa. She hadn't moved. She still stood exactly where she'd poured the wine, almost as if her feet refused to leave that spot. He slowly walked over, stopped a few feet away. She couldn't even look him in the eyes. "I'm ashamed." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I know. I ruined something that can't be replaced." She looked at the stained suit. "I'm so sorry." Keanu gently touched one of the wine stains. "My father gave me this suit." She nodded through tears. "I heard. He wore it when he signed the paperwork that created this company." She closed her eyes. "I didn't know." "No, you didn't." She finally looked at him. "I'll resign." The ballroom became silent once more. Richard immediately nodded. "So will I." Neither of them argued. Neither asked for another chance. Keanu remained quiet for several long seconds, then finally spoke. "If I accept your resignations tonight, everyone here learns one lesson." Vanessa looked confused. "What lesson?" "That fear changes people." He slowly shook his head. "I don't want people changed by fear." He looked around the ballroom. "I want them changed because they finally understand." The room fell completely silent. Nobody knew what decision he was about to make. Not even William. The ballroom remained silent. Not one executive dared whisper. Not one waiter moved. Everyone waited for Keanu's decision. Vanessa stood with tears running down her face. Richard stared at the floor. Neither of them tried to defend themselves anymore. Keanu quietly looked around the room, then asked a question no one expected. "How many of you have made a mistake you'll never forget?" The room became still. Slowly, hands began rising. One director, a vice president, a shareholder, even William raised his hand. Within moments, almost every hand in the ballroom was in the air. Keanu nodded. "I've made them too." He looked toward the audience. "When I was 26, I nearly closed our first factory." Several people looked surprised. "I thought cutting jobs would save the company." He smiled sadly. "My father looked at me and asked one question." He paused. The room listened. "Are you trying to save the company? Are the people who make it worth saving?" Keanu looked down for a moment. "I never forgot that." He slowly turned toward Richard. "You became an executive because you're intelligent." Richard nodded quietly. "I suppose you became vice president because you delivered results." Another nod. But somewhere along the way, Keanu looked directly into his eyes. "You started believing titles made people valuable." Richard closed his eyes. "They don't." "No, they don't." Then Keanu faced Vanessa. "You poured wine on a stranger because you believed appearances told you someone's worth." She wiped away tears. "I was cruel." "You were." "I judged someone I didn't know." "You did." She took a deep breath. "I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Keanu quietly answered. "I hope not." She looked confused. "What?" "I hope you remember it. Not because it hurts, but because it changes who you become." The entire ballroom fell silent again. William watched Keanu carefully. He smiled. Sarah would have answered exactly the same way. Keanu looked toward every executive. "My father fired people." A pause, but only. After after he was certain he had refused to become better. He looked back at Vanessa. "I'm not certain of that yet." Relief spread across Vanessa's face, then disappeared when Keanu continued, "But neither of you will be returning to your current positions." Richard slowly nodded. "I understand." "No, I don't think you do." Keanu walked toward the stage. He picked up the microphone one last time. "Effective tomorrow, Richard Langford is no longer vice president." A wave of whispers spread through the ballroom. Richard simply lowered his head. "Vanessa Langford is no longer welcome to represent this company at any corporate function." She quietly nodded. "I understand." Keanu looked toward human resources. "I want both of them to spend the next 6 months working alongside the people they overlooked." He looked around the ballroom, not as executives, not as honored guests, but as employees. Richard frowned slightly. "What kind of work?" Keanu smiled. "The kind that built this company." Monday mornings, they would report to the oldest factory. Tuesday nights, the warehouse. Wednesday, customer service. Thursday, maintenance. Friday, the cafeteria. Every week, a different department, a different lesson. Richard slowly asked, "And after 6 months?" Keanu looked at him. "Then we'll ask the people working beside you whether you've earned another opportunity. No performance reviews, no executive opinions, no board vote. The people who had once been invisible would decide." Maria quietly smiled. The young waiter smiled too. Even the maintenance supervisor from the factory couldn't hide his grin. For the first time, the people at the bottom of the organizational chart had been trusted with the biggest decision. William leaned toward Keanu. "I've never seen anything like this." Keanu smiled faintly. "My father did it twice." "He did. He believed, if you can't earn respect from the people doing the hardest jobs, you don't deserve respect from anyone else." The ballroom erupted into applause, not because someone had been punished, because justice had finally met wisdom. As the applause faded, Samuel Brooks slowly stood. The 80-year-old founding director walked toward Keanu, carrying a small wooden presentation box. "I've been waiting years to give this back." Keanu looked puzzled. "What is it?" Samuel opened the lid. Inside lay the very first employee identification badge the company had ever issued. The photograph showed a 22-year-old Keanu, grease-covered overalls, safety goggles resting on top of his head, a huge smile. Samuel laughed. "You insisted on being employee number 1. Keanu smiled at the old photograph. "My father wouldn't let me have another number." "What did he say?" Keanu gently picked up the badge. A memory filled his mind. He smiled. He said, "One day, people might call you the owner. Never forget, you were an employee first." The room became completely silent. Every executive, every shareholder, every employee finally understood why the company had become successful. It had never been built by the man at the top. It had been built by the man who never believed he was above anyone else. 6 months later, the company looked stronger than ever, not because profits had increased, Although they had, not because new contracts had been signed. Although they had, the biggest change couldn't be measured on a financial report. People smiled again. Factories felt different. Warehouses felt different. Offices felt different. The company had remembered who it was. At 6 o'clock every morning, former Vice President Richard Langford reported to Factory 3, not in a tailored Italian suit, in steel-toe boots, protective gloves, safety glasses. The first week, his hands blistered. The second week, his back ached. By the third, he stopped complaining. One afternoon, Frank, the elderly machinist, watched Richard struggling to move a heavy gearbox. He quietly walked over. "Lift with your legs." Richard laughed. "I've heard that before." Frank smiled. "Apparently, you weren't listening." Both men laughed. Across the factory, Maria pushed her cleaning cart toward the hallway. Richard immediately stepped forward. "I've got it." She smiled. "You don't have to." "I know. I want to." Maria looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're learning." Meanwhile, Vanessa spent most of her days in customer service. The first morning, a frustrated elderly woman began shouting because her order had been delayed. 6 months earlier, Vanessa would have called security. Instead, she listened. She apologized. She solved the problem herself. As the woman prepared to leave, she smiled warmly. "You treated me with kindness." Vanessa quietly replied, "I'm trying to become someone who deserves to." Word spread quickly through the company. The executives weren't pretending. They had actually changed, not because they feared Keanu, because they had finally understood him. Exactly 6 months after the gala, the annual Employee Appreciation Day arrived. Unlike the glamorous board gala, this celebration took place at the original factory. No tuxedos, no luxury ballroom, just long wooden tables beneath strings of lights stretching across the warehouse floor. Workers brought homemade food. Children ran between tables laughing. Retired employees returned to visit old friends. It felt like family. Keanu stood near the entrance, wearing the same navy suit. The wine stain had never completely disappeared. A faint crimson mark still rested along one sleeve. William noticed it immediately. "You never replaced it." Keanu gently looked down. "No, you could have." "I know." William smiled. "Why keep it?" Keanu thought for a moment. "Because every time I see it, I remember 2 things. What? How quickly people judge. And," he smiled, "how beautifully people can change." William looked toward Richard and Vanessa. Both were laughing with factory workers, not as executives, as teammates. "I never thought I'd see that," Keanu quietly answered. Neither did they. As the evening continued, Frank climbed onto the small stage. He tapped the microphone. "I've worked here 43 years. The warehouse became quiet. I've seen 3 chairmen." He smiled toward Keanu. "But I've only ever known one boss." Laughter echoed across the room. Frank pointed toward Keanu. When he was 22, he swept these same floors. Several younger employees looked surprised. He ate lunch beside us. He worked overtime beside us, and he never asked for special treatment. Frank smiled proudly. He didn't inherit respect. He earned it. The warehouse erupted into applause. Keanu slowly walked onto the stage. He looked around. Thousands of faces. Workers, families, retirees, executives, all together. My father used to tell me. He smiled. A company isn't made of buildings. It isn't made of machines. And it certainly isn't made of money. He looked across the crowd. A company is simply people choosing to build something together. He paused, then looked toward Richard. Come up here. Richard froze. Me? Yes. He slowly walked onto the stage. Nervous, Keanu turned toward the crowd. 6 months ago, this man made the worst decision of his career. Richard lowered his head. Keanu continued. But today, I'd like Frank to answer one question. He looked toward the elderly machinist. Has he earned another chance? Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the factory, then smiled. Richard, yes. What's my granddaughter's name? Richard answered without hesitation. Emily. And what did she graduate in last month? Mechanical engineering. Frank grinned. And where's she starting work on Monday? Richard smiled. Right here. The old machinist laughed. That's all I needed. He turned toward Keanu. I'd trust him again. The warehouse burst into applause. Richard covered his face. For the first time in years, he cried, not because he'd been forgiven, because he'd earned it. Keanu looked toward Vanessa. How about you? Maria stood. She smiled warmly. I've got something to say. Everyone became quiet. 6 months ago, she would have walked past my cleaning cart. She looked at Vanessa. Yesterday, she helped me finish my shift so I could get home early for my grandson's birthday. Maria smiled. I think Sarah would have liked that. Vanessa broke into tears. Keanu looked around the warehouse. My father believed everyone deserves a second chance. He smiled. But second chances must be earned. He looked at Richard and Vanessa. You earned yours. The applause lasted nearly a full minute. As the celebration came to an end, the sun slowly disappeared beyond the factory roof. Workers began heading home with their families. Children waved goodbye. Music faded into the evening breeze. Keanu remained standing near the entrance, looking across the factory floor. The same floor he'd swept as a young man. The same floor he'd walked only hours before the gala. William joined him. You know, the board keeps asking me why this company succeeds. Keanu smiled. What do you tell them? William looked around at the workers, hugging one another goodbye. I tell them because our greatest investment was never the factories. It was the people. Keanu nodded quietly. My father would have agreed. He looked one last time at the faded wine stain on his sleeve, then smiled. They poured wine on a suit, thinking they were humiliating a stranger. He looked around at the people laughing together. They never realized they were only revealing themselves. The factory whistle echoed one final time. Workers waved as they walked toward the parking lot. And in that moment, Keanu wasn't remembered as the billionaire who owned the company. He was remembered as the employee who never forgot where he came from.